Tutorial Tuesday, welcome back. What are we doing today? Today we're going to be looking at processing kicks and snares. And in order to do that, I thought we would also pull up some hi-hats first. I have hi-hats down here in Ableton Slicer. I think this last loop came out decent. And already just transposing those notes around, you can see we transformed the pattern and made it more complex. The first thing we should keep track of is the peak volume of the hi-hats before they're unaffected. So without effects, the hi-hats are minus 13.4 dB. What I'm going to do here is dial in the level of compression. And the way that I start is I make the attack as long as possible and the release as short as possible. And then I sort of do this reverse dial in. The attack gradually becomes shorter and the release gradually becomes longer until we get this happy balance where the compressor is really just locking into those sounds. We're going to add compression 100% wet, and then we're going to dial it back to taste. Notice that as I decrease the attack time, we hear that snappy beginning of the strike. That's what we want to bring out. You can see if we go too far, we lose it. Maybe around there. And you can hear already how much more springy it is. It sounds like it's like bouncing off a rubber surface or something. It's hard to describe exactly what compression does, but it definitely makes the sound more pronounced to our ears. All right, so decreasing the threshold now brings back some of the body of the hi-hat. Here's no compression or just a slight amount. Very metallic. That might be too much, but it's enough. It's enough to bring in the tone or the characteristics. So now I'm going to dial it back with dry wet. Perfect. And you can see we've actually not made our signal any louder. Our signal is minus 13.4 dB without compression, and with compression, our signal is minus 13.6. So that's awesome. We actually decreased the volume level. This is actually quieter than the previous signal. So unaffected is louder. This is with effects, it's quieter, technically. It might be louder in terms of like our perceived loudness, but in terms of like measurable volume with decibels or whatever that's called, yeah, it's technically quieter. So the next thing that I have for us is I pulled up a pretty lousy kick and I pulled up a pretty lousy snare on purpose. I wanted you to hear what a beat sounds like using bad samples and how we can then affect those samples and save the beat. So here's our kick. Pretty flubby. So I'm going to dial in a quick pattern here. All right, we got it in the last one. So now we've got this kick, right? I mean, it's not hurting anybody, but it's also not going anywhere, you know? I'm going to record a snare for a few minutes here. We'll take our best recording, we'll loop it, and then we'll affect both of them. Here's our snare. All right, awesome. Got something there. I'm just going to take this last loop, and here's our pattern. Okay. And what we want to do now is we want to affect the kick and snare to make this like an actual beat that sounds like it's knocking. I have new kit VHS pulled up. I have my kick snare selector kit that I showed you in the previous tutorial. Down the end, I'm going to copy this kick snare processing to our kick and snare that we have here. So that's everything after the sample. Copy paste to new kick effects. Same thing with snare. Everything after samples here says new snare process. I'm going to copy this to my new snare effects track. Let's go in order. I'll describe the list of effects first, and then we'll turn them on one by one. The first thing we have here is we have utility with left selected. That means that it's going to be mono. If the kick is in stereo, it's only going to take the left channel of the kick. I like to switch between left and right, choose which channel I want to take. Now I have a mono kick. After that, we have some processing for tone. You can bring out tone with compression. What I'm trying to do is latch on to the body of the kick. The way that I do that is I dial in parallel compression the same way we just did with the hi-hats. I start with a very short release, a very long attack, a very high ratio, and a very low threshold. And then what I do is I dial it into taste. Attack is how far into the sample you want it to clamp down on. Let's say our attack is 33 milliseconds. That means that 33 milliseconds of the sample is going to pass through unaffected before the compressor clamps down. The release is the opposite. The release is when the compressor lets go. So 33 milliseconds of the snare have passed through unaffected. The compressor clamps down. How long does the compressor hold on to that snare before it releases? This we're going to have to dial in by ear. Afterwards, what we're going to do is lift the threshold up a little bit so the kick can breathe again, and then we're going to dial back the dry wet to taste. We can also bring the ratio back so it's not such aggressive compression. Anything over here is going to be less compression. This is less sensitive. This is really drastic. After the compressor, we have KSHMR Essentials Kick over here. This is awesome. It has 8 different parameters for you to choose from. The first is adding a little bit of sub. I'm pretty sure what this does is just mixes in a low sine wave for whatever note you choose. Usually what you want to do is set it to the key of your track or maybe the relative major minor. We have mid, this is a mid-range EQ. We have air, which is a high-range EQ. We have trans for transient. How much of that transient do you want to cut through the mix? We have tape characteristic. We have pressure, which adds kind of weight behind the kick. We have some compression, and we also have width. Do you want it to be mono and dead center, or do you want it to be wide and stereo? After KSHMR Essentials Kick, I also have Cymatics Diablo. I have the full version. I bought this. I really like it. I think it's great. Cymatics has some great sample packs. They have a bunch of freebies too if you guys are looking into getting into them. I imagine you already know about Cymatics. Up here we have a bunch of factory presets. I personally have this already dialed into like a level that I like. 65 is a low C, so this gives it like a low C boost. And then what I'll do is I'll change this depending upon the key of the track. Just like how we're adding sub weight with KSHMR Essentials Kick, we're also adding weight to the kick in our plugin over here. So that's the kick processing. The next thing I have is I have utilities in between all of them so I can add input and output gain and sometimes crush them into a plugin or sometimes decrease the volume output from a plugin. I know, yes, that most plugins have input and output gain and then you can do that inside here. But sometimes it's really helpful to see all the utilities lined up and know like, oh yeah, I forgot to turn that off, or oh, this is a volume addition that I made later in the game, and just use a utility for it instead of moving the faders all around. On to snares. Like, how do you process your drums? Please let me know in the comments below. Thank you and have a great day.